Richard was a taxi driver. He was more than simply a cab driver, and he was a man whose heart was larger than his pocketbook. Life hadn't been kind to him lately. Bills piled up faster than his passengers, and each day felt like a battle to stay afloat. Yet, despite the weight of his struggles, Richard had one thing that kept him going: his unwavering belief in kindness. But even the kindest souls don't expect miracles. The clock had just ticked past midnight when Richard spotted her, a woman standing under a flickering streetlight, clutching a small child. Her face was streaked with tears, her body trembling in the chilly night air. It wasn't the kind of scene you could just drive past. Something about her desperation pulled at Richard's heart like a magnet. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and asked gently, "Ma'am, do you need a ride?" Her voice broke as she nodded, struggling to compose herself. "Please, I don't have much money, but I need to get home." Richard waved off her concern. "Don't worry about that. Just get in." As she settled into the back seat, her child resting wearily against her shoulder, Richard couldn't help but glance at her in the rearview mirror. There was a story in her eyes, a deep, painful one that she wasn't ready to share. The ride was quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from the back seat. Richard didn't press her for details. He understood that sometimes silence was the kindest conversation. When they arrived at her destination, a modest apartment complex, she reached into her bag to pull out some crumpled bills. But Richard shook his head. "Keep it," he said firmly. "You need it more than I do." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "But why? You don't even know me." Richard smiled faintly. "Because sometimes we all need a little kindness." She stared at him for a moment, as if trying to comprehend his generosity. Then, with tears welling up again, she whispered, "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." Richard watched as she carried her child into the building, disappearing into the shadows of the night. He didn't think much of it after that. To him, it was just a small gesture, a way to ease someone else's burden, if only for a moment. But fate had other plans. What Richard didn't know was that his simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would turn his world upside down. And the first ripple of that change came just a few hours later. As Richard lay in bed that night, his mind kept drifting back to the woman and her child. Why was she so upset? What was her story? He knew he might never get answers, but the image of her tear-streaked face lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't like him to refuse payment. He needed every penny to keep his head above water. But something about her had been different. It was as if his heart had made the decision for him. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Richard groaned, squinting at the screen. It was late, too late for anyone to be calling. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something told him to answer. "Hello," he said groggily. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was a strange urgency to it. "Is this Richard, the taxi driver?" Richard sat up, suddenly wide awake. Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" The caller introduced himself as Kent. "I'm calling on behalf of the woman you drove home earlier tonight." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Was something wrong? Had something happened to her? "She's safe," Kent reassured him, sensing his concern. "But there's something important we need to discuss. Are you available to meet tomorrow?" Richard hesitated. He didn't know this man or why he was calling, but curiosity gnawed at him. Sure. Where?" Kent gave him an address and a time. "I'll explain everything when we meet. But just know this, your kindness didn't go unnoticed." Before Richard could ask more, the call ended. Where was this going? Why would a complete stranger call him so late at night? And what did he mean by, "your kindness didn't go unnoticed"? Richard had no answers. All he knew was that tomorrow, he would be walking into something far bigger than he could have imagined. The next morning arrived far too quickly for Richard. His head was still spinning from the cryptic phone call, and every fiber of his being was tangled in a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The address Kent had given him led to a part of town Richard rarely ventured into, the kind of place where streets were lined with luxury cars and towering mansions seemed to touch the clouds. As his taxi rolled through the neighborhood, Richard couldn't help but feel out of place. This was a world he didn't belong to, a world he had only seen from the outside. When he finally arrived at the house, it was even grander than he had imagined. A massive wrought iron gate stood in front of a sprawling estate, with perfectly manicured gardens stretching as far as the eye could see. Richard hesitated before pressing the intercom. "Hello, this is Richard," he said, his voice steady despite the flutter in his chest. The gate clicked open without a word, and Richard drove up the long, winding driveway. The house loomed before him, its stone facade gleaming in the morning light. As he stepped out of the car, the front door swung open. A man in a sharp suit emerged, his demeanor calm but welcoming. Richard instantly recognized the voice from the phone. "Richard, thank you for coming," Kent said, extending a hand. Richard shook it, still unsure of what he was walking into. "Of course. Though, I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure what this is about." Kent smiled faintly. "All in good time. Please, come inside." Walking into the house felt like stepping into another world. The floors gleamed like mirrors, chandeliers sparkled overhead, and priceless artwork adorned the walls. Richard's shoes felt too worn for a place like this, and he suddenly became acutely aware of his faded jacket and calloused hands. Kent led him to a sitting room where a familiar face awaited, the woman from last night. But she was different now. Gone was the distraught, tearful figure Richard had met. She was composed, her eyes clear, though they still carried a weight of gratitude. "Richard," she said softly, standing as he entered. "It's so good to see you again." Richard nodded, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Ma'am, I hope everything's all right." She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that instantly put him at ease. "Better than all right, thanks to you." Richard shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone receiving praise for something he considered so small. Before he could respond, Kent spoke up. "You must be wondering why we asked you here." Richard nodded. "The thought did cross my mind." Kent motioned for him to sit, and as Richard took a seat, the woman began to speak. "My name is Bella," she began. "What you did for me last night, it may have seemed small to you, but to me it was everything." She paused, her voice trembling slightly as she continued. "I was at my breaking point. Life hasn't been easy these past few years, and last night, I felt like I had nowhere to turn. But then you showed me kindness without expecting anything in return. That meant more to me than you'll ever know." Richard listened, his throat tight. He had no idea his gesture had made such an impact. Bella glanced at Kent, who nodded encouragingly. "There's more to this story," she said, "and it's time you knew the truth." Bella took a deep breath before continuing. "I come from a wealthy family, a very wealthy family. But a few years ago, tragedy struck, and I distanced myself from them. I thought I could make it on my own, but life had other plans. Last night, I was at my lowest, trying to figure out how to keep going. And then you came along." Richard's brow furrowed. He didn't understand where this was going. Kent leaned forward, his tone serious but kind. "Bella's family learned about what you did for her. They're not just grateful, they're inspired. They believe in rewarding kindness, in lifting up those who embody the values they hold dear. And that's why you're here." Richard blinked, his mind racing. "I don't understand. I just gave her a ride. I didn't do anything special." Bella smiled. "You did more than you realize. You reminded me, and my family, that there are still good people in this world. And we want to thank you in a way that truly reflects what your kindness means to us." Kent stood, his hands clasped in front of him. "Richard, we want to offer you an opportunity, a chance to change your life." Richard's heart pounded as Kent continued. "Bella's family owns several businesses in this city. They've decided to offer you a position, one that comes with stability, a good income, and the chance to build a future. On top of that, they'd like to help you clear any financial burdens you're carrying." Richard's mouth fell open. "Wait, what? Why would you do that for me?" Bella stepped forward, her eyes shining. "Because you deserve it, Richard. You didn't hesitate to help a stranger in need, even when you were struggling yourself. That kind of selflessness is rare, and it's something we want to honor." Richard's head spun. It felt like a dream, too good to be true. but the sincerity in their voices told him it was real. Richard's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, hope, all swirling together in a way he couldn't quite process. But beneath it all was one burning question. How had a simple act of kindness led to this?